And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing nothing but high pressure out here over the Bering Sea, keeping any moisture and storminess either to the west and directing it up to the north, and then cutting across the Chukchi Sea there with this front spreading snow and blowing snow into the western and eventually central Arctic coast late tonight. Winter weather advisories out up there for the next day or two. Strong northeast winds continue with high wind warnings, northeast Prince William Sound, Valdez, and the Juneau-Douglas area for gusts 65 miles an hour in downtown Juneau to 75 to 90 miles an hour, Valdez, Thompson Pass, Keystone Canyon. And for Thursday, weak front with some snow and blowing snow for the North Slope Arctic coast to the Brooks Range. No change to the south, nothing but high pressure for the Bering Sea, mainland Alaska, and the Panhandle. Starting to see an increase in the clouds there with that system down to the south, slowly trying to push north and then northwestward. We'll see the next day. Spread some light snow into the southern southeast coast. Winds stay pretty gusty over the northern Panhandle, keeping it dry and cold there. And less wind now along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound area, but still dry and cold. Light snow continues for the North Slope. And for the coastal water forecast, northeast winds 25 knots on the south coast for Thursday. Gale warnings for the central coast, northeast at 30 knots, and then north coast, gale warnings also, northeast winds 40 knots. And gale warnings also for Lynn Canal tomorrow, north winds 40 knots, seas 9 feet, north at 30 knots for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, northeast winds 25 knots. And for the next day here for the south coast, northeast winds 25, in some cases gusting to 40 knots, central coast, east-northeast at 30 knots, and for the north coast, northeast 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, gale warnings continue for Friday. North winds at 35 knots and north at 30 for Stevens Passage with small craft advisories also for Clarence Strait, north winds at 25 knots. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 25 knots for Thursday. Eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 20 to 40 knots and northeast 25 for the western North Gulf Coast, right on down across the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30 knots, northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 25 with 6 to 8 foot seas in the inlet. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 20 knots now, seas subsiding down to 2 to 5 feet, north at 20 for Kamishak Bay, northeast 20 for the Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast, lighter winds, northeast at 15 knots, Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots. Kodiak Island, gale warnings tomorrow, northeast winds 35 knots in the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeasterlies at 25 knots, northeast 25 for Bristol Bay. And for Friday, Bristol Bay, northeast winds 25 knots. That extends all the way down the coast here to Cape Sarachev. Southern Alaska Peninsula, Pacific side there, north at 25. And Kodiak Island, northeast winds at 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians, east-northeast winds tomorrow, mostly east-northeast or north to east, 20 to 25 knots. Easterlies, 25 to 20 knots for the Adak-Atka area. And small craft advisories for the western Aleutians, east winds 25 knots. And pretty uniform winds also on Friday, maybe a little bit stronger, northeast 25 for the western Aleutians, Amchitka Island, northeast at 30 knots, northeast 25 to 30 for Adak and Atka, and the eastern Aleutians, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Along the southwest coast tomorrow, strongest winds south of Nunivak Island, out of the north at 30 knots there. Otherwise, northwest at 15 for the Yukon Delta coast, southwest at 10 for St. Lawrence Island, west at 10 for Norton Sound, and for St. Matthew Island, south winds of 15 knots, east winds 20 knots for St. Paul and St. George Islands. And for the Pribilofs on Friday, stronger winds out of the north at 30 knots with seas up to 8 feet. St. Matthew Island north at 20, north 20 for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound. And south of Nunivak Island, winds will be north at 30 knots. For the Chukchi Sea, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots for Thursday. Brisk wind advisories for the remainder of the Arctic coast. East winds 30 knots here for the central and east side. West side there, west at 25. And then for Friday, west winds 20 to 25 knots for the western or for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Central coast west at 20. Northwest at 15 for the western coast and the Chukchi Sea. Pretty uniform there. North winds 20 knots. With seas in the ice-free areas there at 3 to 4 feet.